the entire story and timeline of Genshin Impact simplified. Well, sort of. We're gonna go into depth on what happened in every nation during every time period, the more influential characters leading up to our current game and nod cry in 6.1. But it is going to be straightforward, easy to follow, focusing on the main plot points because obviously Genshin's lore and story is very convoluted. An actual timeline touching on every single character, their history could take hours. So this is going to be my somewhat simplified, complete timeline start to finish of Genshin Impact. In the ancient times of Teyvat lived the Dragons, an incredibly smart and advanced race, even building spaceships and traveling beyond Teyvat. The leader among them, Nibelung the Dragon King, along with his 7 sovereigns, the dragons being of the Light Realm, and the main elemental beings of Teyvat. Nibelung then created 3 moons and 3 gods corresponding with them to uphold the laws and nature of Teyvat. Then a mysterious voyager and outsider came to Teyvat and made friends with the dragons and the Dragon King. Then once the voyager left, a mysterious first descender descended upon Teyvat, creating 4 shining shades and shadows of themselves, representing life, death, space, and time, battled the dragons and defeated them. Nibelung would then leave to get help from the Abyss to defeat the usurpers. This mysterious person would be known as the Primordial One, and then would tailor-make Teyvat to cater to humanity, and humanity would prosper under the rule of the angels and Celestia under the Primordial One. Humans were very content living peaceful, ignorant lives, until they started asking questions about the outside world, forbidden knowledge. Then they started to piss off the heavenly principles, which met with divine wrath. All the while the dragons have been stewing pissed off about being usurped and losing their planet. So they started forming kinship with the humans who also now felt segregated. The Moon Sisters that were created by the Dragon King to serve the dragons were forced to side then with the heavenly principles once they usurped, which pissed off the dragons. This mysterious voyager would return, wondering what the hell happened to Teyvat, everything's so strict now. Disguising themselves as a human, fell in love with one of the angels who were also starting to question their role in all this, and their purpose of being created to guide and govern over humanity. This led them to creating a new race in Hyperborea, a secret civilization. Then Nibelung came back with forbidden knowledge heavily corrupted by the Abyss, which pretty much plagued Teyvat, and they went to war again with the heavenly principles, which the dragons and the sovereigns biding their time joined the fray. Seeing how corrupted his old friend was though, this mysterious voyager had to side with the heavenly principles, leading to a war so catastrophic that it pretty much wiped out everything and everyone in Teyvat, permanently scarring the land, and the heavenly principles having to cast down the divine nails. Sumeru used to be covered in a rainforest but led to it being a desert, and Dragonspine becoming a cold, desolate mountain. And because they felt betrayed by the Moon Sisters, they killed 2 of them along with their moons, and the 3rd Moon Sister was killed but their moon left dormant but still intact. Teyvat barely survived this war, but now that the dragons were permanently defeated, the heavenly principles initiated a new world order, inciting the gods and long-life species in Teyvat to fight for a Gnosis, carved from the remains of the 3rd Descender, and visions to be distributed to worthy individuals that could uphold Teyvat, protect it now from the Abyss and external threats. Basically like an incentive and reward system for being good, and living the way the heavenly principles wants you to live. This led to the Archon War that only ended 2,000 years ago before the game's events. In Mondstadt there was a dictator god that lived in the capital, Dikaraban, the god of storms. Mondstadt was a winterly desolate place. A little wind spirit would inherit the powers of Istaroth, and after a huge rebellion and war, they would overthrow the god of storms, and this little wind spirit would take on the form of a bard, being known as Venti, becoming the first and only ever animal archon with the Gnosis. After the god of storms was defeated, Venti terraformed the land so that Mondstadt was now a lush, green, fertile land, not a cold, desolate winter place. While Venti was busy terraforming Mondstadt, an icy, snowy mountain known as Palos Peak got nearly completely buried by Venti's animal powers, with only the peak of it being visible to this day, known now as Musk Reef. The people then abandoned the capital of Mondstadt, which is now known as Storm Terror's lair, and formed a new capital city in Cider Lake, with a nice cathedral built at the top and a statue of their new animal archon. Venti was a very lenient archon, not intervening with his people too much, allowing them true freedom. This worked out okay for the most part, but then around 1,000 years ago, all the rich people of Mondstadt banded together to form an aristocracy, belittling the lower class and even taking slaves. And unfortunately for some wanderers from Natlan that escaped Natlan, they were taken captive to fight in the gladiator pits, but because they're from Natlan, the nation of war, they dominated the gladiator ring, Vanessa being the most renowned of all of them, until she stood up to the nobles in Venti's honor, not even knowing it's the animal archon, and they forced her to fight Ursa the Drake, which she defeated, and then it started a rebellion overthrowing the rich nobles, and Vanessa founding and becoming the first ever Grand Master of the Knights of Favonius, later ascending to Celestia to become one of the Four Winds, the Falcon of the West. Also a group of exceptionally powerful witches with long lifespans, well, most of them, and the founding member of this group, Alice, forms a group known as the Hegsen Circle, which is German for Coven of Witches. They challenge the authority of the animal archon, but instead he invites them to share drinks. And from this day forward, there would be an alliance between the witches, the animal archon, and whoever is the current Grand Master of Mondstadt to protect Mondstadt, but also Teyvat and its borders. In Liyue, a bunch of Adepti would band together under one mysterious Omega Adepti named Rex Lapis, who would be undefeated in the Archon War, defeating many gods in his path, making Rex Lapis the oldest and only ever Geo-Archon. They resided within the Gilly Plains, I can't remember the name of it, this place in Liyue. Then it got flooded out, hence all the water now. Around this time the Stove God shrunk down and went into hibernation mode. Rex Lapis and the other Adepti would then go on to create Liyue Harbor, which would become the central hub of Liyue and their trading. Humans would eventually take over Liyue, while the Adepti would take a back seat, until eventually the Adepti completely went into isolation, to the point where humans don't even see them anymore, keeping to themselves while humans took over Liyue. One of the many gods Rex Lapis killed in the Archon War was a giant serpent-like dragon, one of the more powerful ones he fought, which was actually Zhao's former master. Zhao being so grateful for Rex Lapis granting his freedom, he remains loyal to Rex Lapis to this day. And because Rex Lapis killed so many gods during the Archon War, and their remains plagued the land, he formed his own suicide squad called the Yakshas, to help deal with this problem and corruption, which ultimately led to all the Yakshas going mad in one way or another, with Zhao being the only one left. He almost succumbed to the madness himself, but Venti saved his life. In Inazuma, there were twin gods, Raiden A and Raiden Mei. Raiden A and Raiden Makoto. Raiden A was exceptionally strong and powerful, while Raiden Makoto, not as strong, was a way better leader and delegator. So the twin gods would become the Electro Archons, but outside of a very few select people, because they were twins, everyone just assumed they were the same being, just one individual. Do you remember all those ancient civilizations we just talked about under the primordial one? Well, one of those civilizations survived, but they got sunken into the abyss known as Enkanomiya, where they continued to survive. They got harassed by a god known as the Dragonair of the Depths, until Orobashi fled Chenyu Vale not to get slaughtered by Rex Lapis in his campaign. Orobashi would free the people of Enkanomiya, read the book Before Sun and Moon, and learn about the old world, which then he was sentenced to death by Celestia. He would take the descendants of Enkanomiya, creating a new island known as Watatsumi Island. But because he was sentenced to death and did not want his new civilization to feel that wrath along with him, he went and attacked Yashiori Island and was eventually slain by the Raiden Shogun and her legendary sword, the Mutsuno Hir no Tachi. After Orobashi died, his skeleton can be seen there to this day. the people of Watatsumi refused to acknowledge the Raiden Shogun after their god was killed, and the people of Watatsumi feel that way to this day. One silver lining is their dead deity now Orobashi's remains caused the island of Yashiori to be plagued and corrupted, much like the dead gods the Yaksha try to deal with. The shogunate forces tried to establish strongholds and encampments on this island, but it led to everyone going mad and killing each other. So Yashiori Island acts as a perfect no man's land between the two armies. In Sumeru, there were 3 god kings, King Deshret, Rukkhadevata, and Nabu, the goddess of flowers. Nabu, being from the angel race banished from the old world, knew the secrets and history of Teyvat and told King Deshret. King Deshret was picked by Celestia to be the Archon but refused, choosing to instead rebel, learning about the old world and the fake power they were offering him. Both Nabu and Deshret would die in their attempt to rebel, leaving Rukkhadevata no choice but to save the desert. The corruption and forbidden knowledge King Deshret brought forced Rukkhadevata to isolate the rainforest and then expel her power, saving the desert people, forcing her to be in a shrunken down state and become the first Dendro Archon. Rukkhadevata would save the people of the desert, but the academia and their misinformation campaign would spin this, and the truth would get buried in the sand, no pun intended, so that the people of the desert felt that Rukkhadevata favored the people of the rainforest and killed their deity, causing a lot of strife between the rainforest and desert people that remains to this day. Rukkhadevata also created some little creatures known as the Aranara to help her govern and rule over Sumeru. In Fontaine, the Hydro Sovereign died in the Great War, so the Shade of Life needed to replace the Heart of the Primordial Sea in order to safeguard Teyvat, so they created the first ever Oceanid, Egeria, who would then become the first ever Hydro Archon, and would go on to create many more Oceanids that would populate Fontaine. These Oceanids would then plead to Egeria they wanted to become humans and experience humanity. She thought to herself, sure, I don't see why not. Then the Heavenly Principles went, nope, now Fontaine and everyone that lives there doomed, with an awful prophecy that will come to fruition one day with the flooding of Fontaine and the destruction of everyone living there. It should also be noted too that before Egeria was even created, there was a god king named Remus who was originally from Sumeru, but his land was conquered by the powerful King Deshret, so he fled to Fontaine and established a nation known as Remoria, being the first ever historical capital of Fontaine, a place that prospered under freedom and a lot of drinking, partying, and songs, let's be honest. But he tried to prevent Fontaine's inevitable prophesized destruction with his Grand Symphony, trying to grant his people eternal life, elevating their souls and minds into golems. But ultimately his plan failed, and Remoria is found at the depths of the ocean to this day. In Natlan, the dragons were still very prevalent, having their secret hidden civilizations, along with Xuchotl, the Pyro Sovereign, that after the War of Vengeance was extremely corrupted by the Abyss and started laying waste to Natlan's ley lines. In order to save Natlan, an exceptional hero and human named Xbalanque battled Xuchotl and defeated the dragons, stabbing their eye out in the volcano, but would die in the process, but would be resurrected by the Shade of Death, Renova. With Natlan having such severely damaged ley lines, which would allow the Abyss to have a huge presence in Natlan, the only way for this nation to survive was for Xbalanque and the Shade of Death to make a deal. Humans would become Archons one by one, and the Sacred Flame would allow humans and heroes of Natlan to be resurrected if they win the war, keeping Natlan safe in a constant battle and war with the Abyss, which would last for generations until the current game's events. The Shade of Death would task one of her underling angels, I'm not even going to try to pronounce her name, the Lord of Night, to help construct the Night Kingdom to act as Natlan's ley lines, which would serve this purpose until this very day. The dragon sage that Xuchotl left in charge of the dragon civilization was impeached by the 13 dragon lords after he introduced phlogiston to the primitive humans in order to undermine Celestia. he also created Ochcan, who was his son, a half-dragon, half-human, intending for him to unite the humans and dragons to rise and fight the throne of the heavens as one. Ochcan Natlan was then established by Xbalanque, but once he became Pyro Archon, the king of Ochcan Natlan fell to Ochcan himself, who was friends with the first Pyro Archon. But Ochcan eventually betrays his buddy, becomes a tyrant, and obsessed with killing dragons. Not what his old man had planned for him whatsoever. But the human that would become the second Pyro Archon after Xbalanque would eventually overthrow Ochcan, with Ochcan's mind and body being split in half. One in the Dragon of the City of Flowing Ash, and the other, I'm not going to pronounce that, but it's this little guy. But essentially, because the Natlan Pyro Archon is just a human with a human lifespan, there were a ton of Pyro Archons over the coming years, leading up to the Cataclysm 500 years ago. In Snezhnaya, they would have the first Cryo Archon Belizar that would inherit that role in the Cryo-Gnosis until they would be succeeded by the Tsaritsa. And in recent books of Nodcry, they hint towards an arranged marriage between a descender and the Tsaritsa. Once the Archon War was over 2,000 years before the game starts, Teyvat would somewhat prosper under pretty normal times, while an underground godless nation named Khaenri'ah would form, finding ways to harness the power of the Crimson Moon, able to harness many powers from outside Teyvat, technology and different scientific achievements gathered from outside Teyvat, harness the power of the Abyss, and so much more. This includes summoning Outlanders from outside Teyvat, which includes us, the main characters, one of which would stay dormant in their spaceship while our Abyss twin would integrate into Khaenri'ah civilization, becoming a well-known and important person within Khaenri'ah. It should also be noted too that even mere humans were very exceptional in Khaenri'ah, reaching heights of strength and prestige that was definitely forbidden by the Heavenly Principles. But among them, 5 of these individuals stood out amongst the rest, who want to become even more powerful than the Heavenly Principles, transcending this world, which is highly forbidden. And when Dainslift's older brother Vedalfonir had his eyes gouged out by the King of Khaenri'ah and was placed into prison 500 years ago, the other 4 sinners broke him out of jail but succumbed to the abyss that the king had already been corrupted by, indulging in their greatest desires, which would ultimately doom Khaenri'ah and bring on the Cataclysm, a catastrophe in which the world has never seen. The abyss and its monsters would run amok in every single nation simultaneously, causing untold destruction and damage. This nation went under everyone's nose for far too long, causing the Cataclysm 500 years ago, forcing the Heavenly Principles, the Archons, and all the manpower of Celestia and Teyvat to take down this nation, with many innocent humans in Khaenri'ah getting caught in the crosshairs, the pure-blooded Khaenri'ans being cursed with immortality, while the non-purebloods would be cursed with the wilderness, becoming hilly trolls and monsters. Then a group of them would slowly form the Abyss Order, while another pure-blooded Khaenri'an, angry at the Heavenly Principles, would align with the Tsaritsa, the Cryo Archon, and form a group known as the Fatui, with 11 powerful generals known as the Fatui Harbingers. The Heavenly Principles would be weakened and dormant from this day forward. Now, before we can continue in the timeline, how did the Cataclysm affect each nation? In Mondstadt, we'll talk more about Dvalin, but he fought a dragon Durin, was corrupted, and many knights died fighting the monsters, but ultimately Mondstadt was pretty unscathed. In Liyue, it was similar to Mondstadt, a lot of monsters. There was many Millilith casualties fighting these monsters, and heavy abyssal corruption and monsters in the chasm, with one of the Yaksha sacrificing themselves to keep the abyss at bay, preventing the corruption spreading from the depths. The Cataclysm hit Inazuma pretty hard. There were many casualties, and the nation suffered greatly. Raiden Makoto, the current Archon, went to fight the Abyss in Sumeru, along with many of the other Archons, where Raiden A stayed back in Inazuma. In the epic battle against Khaenri'ah and its monsters, Raiden Makoto was slain, leading to Raiden A losing her sister and many of her friends along the way. Not feeling fit to rule with PTSD, she would create a puppet to rule in her stead. first creating a puppet with emotions and free will, but would ultimately set this puppet free, which would, probably not but definitely will, come back to bite everyone in the ass later. Then she would perfect her design, and then ultimately this puppet would go on to be a pretty big dictator. Also, Raiden A was able to plant a sacred Sakura, the great tree helping keep the Abyss at bay in the future to help them in the past, through the power of time, and Istaroth playing a hand at this. In Sumeru, forbidden knowledge spread like pollution, and it greatly affected the tree of Irminsul. Irminsul acts as like Teyvat's brain, the center of everything. This being corrupted would have ultimately led to the destruction of Teyvat as we know it, since we know Irminsul connects to everyone. Through memories, neurologically, through their minds, it would have been devastating, so Rukkhadevata sacrificed herself to stop that from happening, with one of her last acts taking a remaining pure branch uncorrupted from Irminsul, creating the new Dendral Archon, Lesser Lord Kusanali. Unfortunately, she could not get rid of every little bit of corruption, and this lingering corruption would cause a phenomenon within Sumeru known as the Withering. In Fontaine, a massive dragon from outside Teyvat Ilia appears and attacks the population. They were ultimately able to defeat this dragon, which led to the birth of creatures known as Melusines, which would slowly be integrated into Fontaine society. The Melusines were discriminated against at first, but now people really enjoy their company. While this is happening, the first Hydro Archon Aegeria, also fighting in Sumeru, was killed as well during the Cataclysm in the Great Battle. Rukkhadevata anchoring her life force to the land, making the great tree we see today. Many Oceanids would then leave Fontaine, not wanting to follow Focalors, the new Hydro Archon, like Rodadia of Locke that can be found near Chitsa village in Liyue. Natlan was the nation most heavily affected by the Abyss. The current human that ascended to be the Pyro Archon, Mavwika, from the scions of the Canopy tribe, had to devise a plan along with the heroes of that era, and they were successfully able to repel the abyssal invasion, but it led to everyone dying except for Mavwika. But she devised a plan, being able to be resurrected 500 years later in current game to continue her fight. While Istaroth, the Shade of Time, and potentially the Shade of Space Asmodee orchestrated our Abyss sibling, us, in the future while Khaenri'ah is being destroyed, effectively guaranteeing they would miss the Cataclysm, creating a paradox within Teyvat. But our past selves along with our past sibling would then try to escape Teyvat, being abrupted and stopped and imprisoned by the Shade of Space, Asmodee, sending our sibling down to Teyvat while we are imprisoned for 500 years. Our Abyss sibling goes on an epic journey with Dainsleif until they have a falling out. And then our Abyss sibling joins forces with the Abyss Order, devising a plan to form the Loom of Fate, building an atlas for Khaenri'ah to recreate the underground nation. Sometime before we discover Paimon and begin our journey, Sertologi, one of those powerful 5 sinners, has gotten way more powerful outside Teyvat, even having his own disciple named Skirk, who was a survivor of her homeworld that was destroyed. He trained Skirk to fight, and tells her that one day he will challenge and kill her along with everyone she holds dear if she does not get more powerful so she can be a challenge for him. She then crosses over the borders of Teyvat and runs into Alice, who safeguards Teyvat's borders and regulates who comes in and out. She then journeys across Teyvat, even discovering the old, forgotten civilization of Hyperborea, with their current descendants, the Frostmoon Scions, residing within Nodcry. And then eventually she trains a young boy from Snezhnaya named Ajax, who would become Tartaglia, the 11th Fatui Harbinger. 500 years later, we awaken, and while we're fishing for some food, catch Paimon, who is drowning in the ocean, in Liyue in the Stone Forest. We then tell Paimon our story about being trapped, and start our epic quest to regain our memories and find our lost sibling. As we venture into Mondstadt, coming into contact with our first statue of the 7, realizing we can harness the elements. We then stumble upon the Anemo Archon and Dvalin, one of the 4 winds, who is basically now sick and corrupted from battling a dragon named Durin on Dragonspine. A dragon created by one of the 5 sinners. You remember one of those 5 sinners? The one known as Rhine-Daughter that loved to create monsters using abyssal powers and alchemy, fuses with the Shade of Life, Naberius. But not before creating a super being known as Albedo, also capable of great feats of alchemy and creation. She gives Albedo to Alice and the Knights of Avonius, Albedo acting as a big brother to Klee. Dvalin now being hostile and attacking the citizens of Mondstadt, while the Fatui try to regain influence in the city of Mondstadt. Grandmaster Varka takes 80% of the Knights of Favonius' manpower, leaving Jean Gunhilder as the acting Grandmaster with 20% of their manpower left to deal with the situation. We are able to foil the Abyss Order's plans, weaponizing Dvalin and cure Dvalin of his abyssal corruption, but not before La Signora, the 8th Fatui Harbinger, ambushes us and takes Venti's Gnosis. La Signora was just a maiden in Mondstadt 500 years ago, but her lover, a knight of Favonius, Rostam, was killed during the Cataclysm, and she blames Venti. If the 7 Archons are the 7 deadly sins, then Venti is definitely the sin of sloth. She blames him for not doing anything and went down a dark path, becoming the Crimson Witch of Flames. She was also a prodigy at the Sumeru Academia. This is why she hates Venti, and this is personal for her. And that's why Venti had to catch these hands. Oh shit! A man named Dainsleif shows up in Mondstadt, basically telling us that he hates the gods and telling us the Abyss Order's plan to steal the Eye of the First Field Tiller for their plans of the Loom of Fate. We find a defiled Statue of the Seven, where we meet the Abyss Princess, our mysterious lost sibling, who of course gives us a cryptic message about going on our journey to learn the truth. Can you be any more cryptic? Then we head on over to Liyue, where we go to celebrate their Archon in Liyue Harbor, and Rex Lapis is basically assassinated right away. But not really though. Actually, Rex Lapis is starting to suffer from something called erosion, which is basically dementia for gods, potentially making him dangerous in the future, and he wants to retire. The Tsaritsa and her 11 Harbingers by now already devised their plan to collect every Gnosis for their ambitious plan to overthrow Celestia and their upcoming project called Project Stuja, while they simultaneously set up a huge base in Nodcry, a subnation of Snezhnaya, to harness the power of the moon. And let's be honest, they don't even want to attempt Rex Lapis's Geonosis by force, but they make a deal. The Tsaritsa wants his Gnosis and he wants to retire, but he wants to make sure his nation can survive without him. The Adepti used to run Liyue, but now the humans do. The Adepti kinda took a back seat and secluded themselves. He needs to bring them together, so now he hides in disguise as Zhongli, and basically starts planning his own funeral. And he's broke as a joke. We go visit the Adepti and tell him what happens. Naturally, the Adepti are pissed off and assume the worst in humanity. Tartaglia is tricked by La Signora to revive Osial, a god Rex Lapis defeated in the Archon War. The Adepti and humans all come together along with the Traveler to save the day, proving to Zhongli that they can survive without him. And as promised, he gives up his Geonosis, and Tartaglia is pissed off learning he was used. The pure-blooded Khaenri'ah Piero and the Lord Commander of the Fatui and the Harbingers sends his 6th Harbinger Scaramouche to kill the Traveler and investigate the falling stars, which are actual people's fates and constellations literally falling from the sky. Because Teyvat is like a giant program, Scaramouche then gets sidetracked, realizing he's probably in a giant simulation this whole time and the sky is fake. We then go to Inazuma, while actually we're smuggled into Inazuma with an already escaped convict and refugee Kazuha, because Inazuma's in an all-out decree and dictatorship. Remember that crazy puppet that I told you the Raiden Shogun made? Well, it's been confiscating visions to uphold its program of eternity. The Sakoku decree was so strict that Inazuma's borders were completely sealed, and everyone's confiscated visions were placed for all to see, except for the beings of Watatsumi Island. They still hate the Raiden Shogun and refused to give up their visions. So the most loyal to the Raiden Shogun of the Triforce Commissions, the Kujo clan, went to war with the residents of Watatsumi and their leader Sagonomiya Kokomi, while we ally ourselves with the Yashiori Commission and their leaders Kamisato Ayato and Ayaka. We eventually challenge the Raiden Shogun directly, but naturally we lose this, joining forces with Watatsumi but learning that the Fatui Harbingers have been orchestrating this conflict from behind the scenes, taking advantage of the strife and war, with her long-abandoned puppet Scaramouche running the Delusion Factory, while La Senora goes to negotiate with the Shogun directly. But her ego and pride gets in the way as she accepts a challenge from us directly. Going by Inazuma law and tradition, La Senora is defeated and then slain by the Raiden Shogun puppet, with Yaimiko and the rest of the resistance in Inazuma all banding together to help Raiden A snap out of her funk and reclaim her rightful place as Archon of Inazuma, sidelining her puppet, but her puppet would still have its programming, so we would ultimately still have to deal with it, leaving Inazuma in a state of recovery, but in a much better place. When we arrive in Sumeru, the entire place is filled with uncertainty and conspiracy. The people there are slowly suffering more and more from this corruption of Irminsul and this phenomenon known as the Withering, and people like Tegnari are doing their best to try to keep it at bay, while the sages give everyone this fancy headpiece, giving everybody Wi-Fi in Sumeru to hijack their dreams and create a 3-day samsara. As the academia corrupted over time, the new Dendro Archon Nahida, Lesser Lord Kusanali, was imprisoned and basically forgotten by her people. They refused to accept her as the new Dendro Archon, and the sages of the academia would rule over Sumeru, being manipulated by the Fatui Harbinger known as the Doctor, who was expelled from the academia many years ago. They would plot to replace Nahida with a man-made god, with Scaramouche and his electronosis being the basis of this experiment, to help fix the decaying Irminsul and the corruption of knowledge. Ultimately, we're able to uncover the truth of this, with the help of our new friends in Sumeru that already speculated that the academia was corrupt, like Alhaitham and Sino, who acts as the academia's muscle, which leads to an epic battle with a nearly completed false god, securing the electronosis, and in order to cleanse the corruption left in Irminsul, Greater Lord Rukkhadevata, what was left of her, not only completely erases herself, but erases her entire legacy and memory, so nobody in Teyvat would ever remember who she was. Since Irminsul was corrupted and she was the old avatar of Irminsul, naturally she was corrupted along with it. I guess when you have to do a complete factory reset, it is what it is. But the current Dendro Archon would negotiate the two Gnosis with the Doctor for secrets of Teyvat, after which she would rehabilitate the 6th Fatui Harbinger and the Shogun puppet Scaramouche, erasing him from Irminsul and allowing him a fresh start. But because the Traveler is a descender and not tethered to the land, naturally we remember Rukkhadevata and we help Nahida remember as well. We then meet a pure-blooded Khaenri'ah cursed with immortality named Clothar, who fell in love with a woman from Mondstadt 500 years ago, having a son named Caliber. Unfortunately, when they were cursed, his son got the curse of the wilderness. This led to Clothar founding the Abyss Order, with our Abyss siblings still being the prince or princess, but he went mad about 100 years ago, and then eventually disappeared. We then head on over to Fontaine, who still has the prophesized demise hanging over their heads, and the water levels have been rising every year, and there's a lot of tension in Fontaine. 500 years ago, Focalor, one of the most exceptional Oceanids under Egeria, became the new Hydro Archon. But in order to save everyone from this flood, she devised a plan. The plan is to destroy the very concept of the Hydro Archon and their divine throne, returning the power to the original rulers, the Sovereigns, and the new reincarnated Hydro Sovereign Neuvillette. But in order to do this, she needs to accumulate energy in the Oratrice, used in the courtroom of Fontaine. But in order to prevent Celestia from realizing that Focalor is basically working on screwing them over, she divides herself in half, separating herself into her human form and her divine form, with her human form being Farina. Farina having to act and pretend to be the Hydro Archon now for the next 500 years, which effectively works for the most part, except for a few people being suspicious. While in the Fortress of Meripede, an exceptional warden puts all the convicts to work for something good in creating a giant ship in case the prophecy does come true. Also doing their best to keep the Primordial Sea at bay, since the Primordial Sea will actually dissolve all the people from Fontaine, since remember, the people from Fontaine are actually Oceanids, not human. Once Nublet has his full power and authority restored by Focalors after she sacrifices herself, he then turns the people of Fontaine into real humans now. And the flood still quote-unquote happens in the eyes of Celestia, but not before smacking around the all-devouring Narwhal, which is a creature from outside Teyvat, possibly related to the Leviathans from Honkai Star Rail, we have no idea. Sertologi that now resides outside Teyvat kept this thing as a pet, and it breached Teyvat, so we had to deal with it, and then Skirk yeets it and child through a portal and tells us about the Gnosis and how they're the remains of the third Descender. We then run into our Abyss sibling who's trying to create an atlas to recreate Khaenri'ah through the ley lines, who needs the eye of the first field tiller from Dainsliff, and then they tell us that the Heavenly Principles is still asleep but will awaken soon. In Natlan, everything is status quo. Most of the old dragons from the ancient days have evolved into Saurians that get along and integrated with the tribes of Natlan, each tribe forming a close bond with one of the Saurians. But most of the ancient technology of the dragons has been lost, except for in a few cases where they uncover some of this technology, hence why the Pyro Archon has a motorbike. Mavwika the Pyro Archon during the Cataclysm, who we talked about already, re-emerges in current day, and they continue their pilgrimage to fight back the Abyss and win the war. 500 years ago, however, while Mavwika disappeared, a powerful commander and general by the name of Thrain, cursed with immortality along with the majority of his platoon, had to flee Khaenri'ah and assisted in Natlan fighting back the monsters in the Abyss, making friends with the tribes here. And he made a promise to the Masters of the Nightwind tribe of that era to save Natlan from the Abyss one day. Now he's returned to do just that. The captain's plan is to uncover old dragon technology in a backup plan if the Pyro Archon's plan doesn't work. His plan involves sacrificing Natlan's history for its survival, whereas the Pyro Archon refuses to do that, wanting the legendary heroes that came before to live on through memory and the ley lines, and what's left of their damaged ley lines through the Wyeb. Ultimately though, the captain and the Pyro Archon are able to compromise and work together. Since the Pyro Archon had to use the majority of her power to keep the Abyss at bay, she is now weakened, so the captain along with his soldiers is a much needed help in Natlan. Then the Abyss launches its great attack, which led to both many people and Saurians dying at the hands of the Abyss, including Chaska's sister. The current day heroes along with the Pyro Archon are able to keep the Abyss at bay, blasting a hole right through the false sky, revealing one of the dead moons beyond. The Abyss now taking on the form of the dead Pyro Sovereign, Shukato. With an all-out battle and confrontation, we are able to defeat the Abyss for good, saving Natlan. And the captain using his immortal body, able to stick it to the Shade of Death, acting as an anchor for all the dead souls, both Khaenri'ah and Natlan. Xbalanque, the first Pyro Archon, part of his deal was, if one of his descendants were to ever actually win the war, he could come back for one day and witness the victory, which he does. We then reach the point in the timeline and story where this paradox took place 500 years ago, successfully completing the bootstrap time loop and paradox, with our Abyss sibling having the Atlas to recreate Khaenri'ah completed. The three remaining shades of the Primordial One have a meeting to discuss their fourth colleague, the Shade of Space Asmodee. hinting towards them potentially betraying them and following a new master, which is more than likely the Abyss, but it's hard to say. Maybe a Kevin Kazlana variant, we don't know. And that's when we get to Nodcry. Nodcry being a sub-nation of Snezhnaya, but its own nation altogether. 500 years ago after the Cataclysm, during the War of Vengeance, we talked about the 3 moon sisters and goddesses that were killed by the dragons for betraying them. 2 of the moons themselves were shattered, with the frost moon remaining intact. This led to a reincarnated moon goddess being born after the Cataclysm, and the frost moon scions that are descendants of the angels named this goddess Kutar. But she would ultimately feel confused, isolated from her true source of power with the barrier of the false sky, and being used by the frost moon scions to grant meaningless wishes and solve everyone's problems. So she would leave Nodcry and get recruited by the Fatui, who also wanted to use her for her powers, which they would, leading her to abandon the Fatui, seeking refuge back in Nodcry with the current leader of the Frost Moon Scions, Lauma, keeping her secret and safe. Backtracking a little bit now, you know those 5 sinners? Well, one of them, named Rarier, was given the job by the King of Khaenri'ah to kill an entire species of human, all connected to the Crimson Moon. The king was sort of going insane with abyssal corruption and just the potential insecurity of being overthrown. So he wanted every single descendant of the Crimson Moon slaughtered, and that was Rarier's job. He also had a fiancé and seemed like a pretty actually normal guy, I mean outside the fact that he's committing genocide, and although he hated himself for doing this, he always found reasons to justify his actions like they were an actual threat, even though some of these Crimson Moon people were just kids. It's not until he learns his fiancé is indirectly connected to the Crimson Moon dynasty and he orders him to kill her as well. If you want me to kill kids, that's fine. But the chick I'm banging, are you serious? So then naturally now he betrays the king, and the 5 sinners overthrow the king of Khaenri'ah, but come in contact with the abyssal corruption like we already learned, and henceforth, the Cataclysm. But during those 500 years, Rarier, trying to find his beloved fiancé that went through a portal, had his body shredded apart, being cast in the shadow of the moon, all of his fragments being scattered, and he created an army known as the Wild Hunt that are now also scattered. The Light Keepers are a group that formed to keep the Wild Hunt at bay. But his main fragment is in one of the Light Keepers' lanterns, Flynn's. He needs Kuvaki energy to piece himself back together like the perfect Humpty Dumpty. So he impersonates people in Nodcry to trick them into rebuilding the cannon and blasting himself and being reborn. All the while, Sandrone, the 7th Fatui Harbinger, and the Frost Moon Scions are at each other's throats to claim the moon fragments and influence over Nodcry. Once Rarier pieces himself back together, he realizes he can go straight for Columbina, the new moon goddess, and get the bulk of his Kuvaki energy he needs, which forces us to band together with everyone in Nodcry, even including the long-awaited Grandmaster of the Knights of Avonius that's been away since the game started. Realizing that one of the 5 sinners is too powerful to defeat directly, we devise a plan to use his power against him and yeet him through a portal, giving him that Tartaglia treatment, which we successfully do. In order for this to work, we needed the power of the moon goddess. Being that she has no connection to her power source, her strength is depleted. At least giving her a power-up that was comparable to when she was the 3rd Harbinger, we need to seek out the 3rd missing moon fragment of the iridescent moon, which is actually the Crimson Moon Khaenri'ah used to harness, or at least it's the dead corpse of this moon, corrupted and infused with the Abyss. Arlecchino, being a descendant and survivor that fled Khaenri'ah to seek refuge in Fontaine, is able to use her powers in connection to the Crimson Moon to open this doorway so we can power up Columbina. Rarier now successfully banished, but will he return? And everything in Nodcry that's happened so far, all of which everything in Nodcry is more than likely been orchestrated by the Doctor behind the scenes, now the Doctor knowing exactly where all the moon fragments are now. And that is the complete timeline and story of Genshin Impact caught right up to current game. Some closing remarks before I end the video though. What is Teyvat really? Is Teyvat a simulation just like Amphorius? Everything not real as we perceive it, but all within its own little program of some sort? What is the Hexen Circle's endgame? Do they just mean to protect Teyvat, or are they also hoping to overthrow Celestia and the Heavenly Principles? Where are the remaining sovereigns we haven't met yet? Like the Electro Sovereign, the Animo Sovereign, the Geo Sovereign? Or is Teyvat, like the Hexen Circle like to depict, just a story? A story told by a higher dimensional being? Is Teyvat connected to the rest of the Honkai-verse, like Honkai Star Rail and Honkai Impact? Are there actually two Abyss twins? We can pick between the two when we start the game, but knowing what we know now with the discrepancies in Noncry with the spaceship, are there actually two Abyss twins? Or have we been lied to and tricked this entire time? And finally, I want to say thank you so much for watching. There was a lot of information I had to disclude, and this video is still more than likely gonna be pushing the half-hour to 45-minute mark, because there is just that much lore to go over. I tried to stick to all the main plot points of every nation through every time period, but there was a lot of context and story elements I didn't want to disclude. For example, the story of the Thunderbird, and the whole story of Sarami Island in Inazuma, more history of the desert in Sumeru, more context about the dragons in Natlan and the Dragon Lords, for example. So in the future, I do plan on making a timeline video like this, but to go way more in depth on every single nation, with every nation getting its own timeline video. And lastly, before I wrap up the video, Paimon is probably not, but most certainly is, the primordial one that created the Four Shades, defeated the dragons, and is the true ruler of Celestia.